Hey everybody, it's a big day in artificial intelligence news with the dropping of the Future of Life Institute petition that's gathered a lot of legitimate signatures in the AI and ML space, a lot of august names in artificial intelligence research calling for a pause on the development of large language models. Folks like Yoshua Bengio and Stuart Russell. Obviously, Elon Musk's name is there. I'll have to mention him in the key tags just for the viral factor there, probably. There's a lot of names on this petition calling for this pause, and obviously that's quite a big deal. And there's really an interesting bleed over here between two of my biggest interests, that being artificial intelligence, machine learning, and also international politics. And I wanted to explain a bit about the connection that I see between these two issues that's kind of been highlighted by this petition. But just to briefly summarize the content of the petition, the folks who put it together are saying that these powerful AI systems, we're not actually confident how they work or if they're manageable. A lot of our tests, as I've talked about before in a previous video, I'll link above, a lot of our tests that we like to use to determine consciousness really aren't going to give meaningful results for these models, given their complexity, given the large size of the corpora, the text corpora that they're trained on, and also the incorporation of reinforcement learning with human feedback and other kinds of adjunct model additions to these modeling pipelines that are really designed to filter the probability distribution or distributions that undergird these models. Really, these additional ways of filtering this information are using human feedback, so these models are able to really closely approximate human conversation. So basically, the petition is saying we need to pause development here at the sort of GPT-4 level while we determine can we guarantee that this development will be sort of pro-social and positive, and that the risks of these models will be positive and predictable, and sort of will they correspond to sort of can we ensure that the alignment problem, the internal and external alignment problems, which I'll probably make another video on soon, can be satisfied with these models development. So these folks want to pause development for 6 months and start to develop joint measures, joint implementations of shared safety protocols, which I think all this sounds like a great idea if you want my opinion on it. And basically saying we want to make sure that these models are safe beyond a reasonable doubt before we continue to develop them. But really what I wanted to focus on was, near the end of the petition, they start to diverge from talking about the implications of the models and how the models work and what they can and can't do and how are we going to measure that, to working with, having developers work alongside policymakers to accelerate AI governance systems. And they note at a minimum, this should include, new regulatory authorities dedicated to AI systems, oversight and tracking of AI systems. Interestingly, they want to track the pools of computational horsepower, essentially, that can train these kinds of systems, to be able to pinpoint where this training is happening. They want to incorporate provenance and watermarking systems, which is something that folks have talked about for quite some time, and I'm quite skeptical of, but is probably something that needs to happen anyway. They mentioned liability for AI-induced harm. I think that's sort of what appears to me to be sort of a legal infrastructure for how to regulate these models, which would be another really fascinating video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to start to dig into that issue with some people who are, subject matter experts in the legal world. They want to increase funding for AI safety research, which I think is a very astute point. This is something that often gets put to the side because it doesn't directly impact profit margins. And they also note that we need to start building institutions to deal with the political, economic, dramatic social disruptions that could result from this technology, as I've noted again in the video I linked before, and hell, I'll link it again here as well. Whether these models are sentient or not, actually, is a very important debate and obviously a huge concern, but actually just the power that they already have to replace human labor is quite likely to disrupt human economic and social life and political life as it stands now. And so to sort of segue into what I really want to talk about in this video, because I think there's a lot of interesting points in the petition, and In full disclosure, I became a signatory of it after I read it. One thing that I noticed that was missing, and it stuck out to me probably due to my background as a scholar of international studies, is a lot of what they're describing here at the end of the petition in terms of regulatory systems and oversight of large pools of computational capability, right? So basically what they're describing here is we want to track and tag where these systems can be trained, because it actually shows up. It could actually, be somewhat easy to track because it requires such huge compute resources. One thing they neglect to mention in that section of the document is that any effort like that would need to be inherently deeply international in nature, right? This would have to be something agreed to by certainly all of the peers and near peers of the United States itself, probably other actors, including Israel, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, obviously China and Russia. I would include in the peer or near peer category. This would require a consortium of international actors that really, in many ways, have nothing in common and are in deeply competitive or even adversarial game situations. So while I'm not against the idea in and of itself, I think they deeply undersell the difficulty of this kind of operation to track these sort of efforts and to get people to sign on to them in any kind of timely way is in and of itself going to be extremely difficult. Even with that done, right, say you could get China, Russia, a handful of what we used to call the Asian tigers in East Asia, a few countries in the Middle East, the United States, which is its own ball of yarn in terms of international agreements, right? And maintaining those and upholding those, even when they're the ones who, or I could say we're the ones who created or originally signed them. Say we get all these actors to the table and they all sign in the next 6 months, and it's a perfect storm, right? And there's a perfect recognition that this is an emergent problem that must be regulated as quickly as possible. The history of international agreements and treaties around what is essentially arms control at this point is not a good one. We can think about the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. We can think about the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. These both obviously emerged out of World War I, and both of these arms control treaties ended as soon as was possible, essentially, for the state actors that were constrained by them, right? The moment that they could get out, they did so. Closer to the current era, right, you can think about the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. This was obviously a treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union to restrict and locate the ABM sites within these countries, and so to avoid an arms race in that regard, and in that way avoid sort of, you could think about it as an arms race, but these could also be thought about as defensive technologies. But the idea was, if you allow one of these strategic competitors to build out an anti-ballistic missile system, perversely in a world governed by what's called a Nash equilibrium, and really this concept that flows out of that of mutually assured destruction. If ABM systems were allowed to propagate and defend a substantial or a total amount of a country's territory, that country would no longer be constrained by the game logic of mutually assured destruction, and would actually, again, perversely become more likely to launch a preemptive strike, a nuclear strike against their adversary, because they would be comparatively well positioned to survive such a conflict. So the ABM Treaty was signed in 1972. The United States obviously played a huge role in developing it. However, in 2001, George W. Bush pulled the United States out of that treaty because he saw it as unduly, unnecessarily constraining the United States to defend itself against what was then termed the axis of evil. And this was really part of the post 9/11 move to reposition the United States security policy domestically and internationally that's had decades of mostly negative ramifications for the United States and the world. So you can see there's not a good history here. These treaties are incredibly hard to come to an agreement on. They're hard to get people at the table. They also tend to be extremely non-durable and not long-lived, right? Because they inherently constrain the movement of an actor whose position may change at some point in the future. And what I would note is, if we want such arms control, or in this case AI development control, to be more durable, we need to be deeply cognizant of selling it and pushing it as a product, not of any kind of normative or moral stance, because that tends to be less effective, in my opinion, than the alternative, which is really to propose it as the outcome of the state of the game between the actors who can develop these technologies, right? You have to actually sell this as in the national interest of each of the participants in the treaty, and you have to make sure that sale of this information is clear to the leadership. It's clear to even to the populace of that country, right? That entering into such an agreement is actually deeply in the national interest of the polity involved, right? People are not going to do this to begin with, and they're certainly not going to maintain such an agreement out of the goodness of their hearts, right? This has to be done from the perspective of, what does it do for us? What has it done for us lately? And the most successful and long-lived international arms control agreements tend to follow this pattern, right? When you can point out that breaking out of such an agreement is actually deeply not in the safety interest of the country involved. That's where you see a more durable compliance with the original agreement. So while it's often said these kinds of agreements, aren't worth the paper they're written on, right? That these are sort of paper tigers. That I tend to actually agree with that assessment, although I'm not necessarily a realist. That often tends to be the case. The times where that isn't the case often correlate heavily to situations where controlling a certain type of munition, controlling a certain type of weapon, or a certain type of technology, in this case, is deeply in the interest of both or all parties involved. That's not to say that it's guaranteed in that circumstance either, but I think if we're looking at where the glimmer of hope here is for enacting some kind of information control, technology control agreement like what the Future of Life petition proposes, we need to remember that it needs to be deeply international, and that it needs to be deeply rooted in sort of a game theoretic or just a game understanding of where each of these parties fits into that space. We need to make sure that we push this narrative as deeply in the interest of the United States, deeply in the interest of the People's Republic of China, deeply in the interest of the Russian Federation, the European Union. And that's where this gets really difficult, right? Is you have to find those cross-cutting cleavages that basically align the interests of all of these different nation states. So that's it for me today. Really, obviously, an interesting topic, and again, I think it's a petition everybody should check out. This is going to be a hugely consequential technology. I'm also really curious what your thoughts are about the international elements of this kind of technology control, and also the other aspects of this petition, the other ways that they're recommending these large language models be constrained and be regulated. I think there's a really interesting domestic discussion here for people interested in U.S. politics as well. So please do let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I really appreciate you watching.